Hey guys, welcome to my channel. For today's video, I'm going to show you step by step how I painted these 3 different autumn landscape scenes using watercolor paint. My paper today is Sennelier. It's 140 pound cold pressed paper and it's on a block. That means the sides are glued down so you don't have to worry about the paper warping and buckling. I'm taking my 1/4 inch painter's tape and applying it all around the edges and then blocking out 3 separate sections. I have a couple of water jars, and the brush I'm using today is a silver black velvet size 8 round brush. You'll just need some colors like orange, red, yellow, and green, just some fall colors on your palette, and I'll tell you which colors I'm using as I paint with them. So the first step with the first painting is to wet the paper. The wet and wet technique is one of my favorite methods to start a painting just to get some really soft diffused washes on the first layer. And so the next thing I'm going to do is start with a very light blue sky using Holbein turquoise blue, and you can see I'm just dabbing it in very gently in one little section. Then I'm going to be painting in the green trees. I'm using Permanent Green No. 1 by Holbein, and I'm just again using a dabbing motion with the tip of my brush to suggest foliage where the green trees are in my reference photo. Make sure to rinse your brush in between colors. When you go in with yellow, you don't want to have the green mixed in. To keep your colors pure, be sure to rinse and blot in between each color. So now I'm applying all of the yellow, and I'm also applying a base layer of yellow on the left side of the painting. And then I'm going in with cadmium red. This is my M-gram cadmium red light, and just dabbing it in. You can see it's exploding on the wet paper, creating a really fun effect of soft diffused edges. Don't be too concerned about how it looks at this stage. We're going to go ahead and add more layers later. So now I'm starting to suggest where the road or the pathway goes in the reference photo. And I'm also starting to just really blot more red paint on the left side. In the reference photo, you can see there's a ton of trees that are just lit up with red and orange and yellow. And so we're just starting to paint in the first initial layers of those red trees, mostly on the left side of the painting. And then I'm taking my transparent orange, this is a Winsor & Newton paint, and I'm starting to paint more in the pathway and suggesting some of those little furrows in the road, and also using that same orange more in the trees again, continuing to blot on the left side and a little bit more specifically on the right side where we're going to have a more realistic tree. I'm also dabbing in some more yellow and just building up those layers gradually, wet and wet, and letting the colors blend naturally on the paper. On the right side, I'm adding more of a bush and again, being more specific with how I'm applying my brush strokes. The next step is to add your dark values. You don't have to wait for the paint to be completely dry to do this. I'm using my Daniel Smith Indigo and also a little bit of Daniel Smith Burnt Umber. The combination of the two actually creates a nice black. And with this, I'm dabbing in suggestions of shadow shapes in between those red leaves. You don't have to be perfect as far as following your reference photo. Make this your own. Just create shapes that are pleasing and that are specific. Now I'm grabbing a darker green that's on my palette. This is Terra Verte by Holbein, and darkening up those green trees more in the center of the painting, and then using yellow ochre where I see the yellow trees, going a little bit darker. You can see we're just blotting and gradually building up the layers, going darker and darker with each layer. I'm using my cadmium red again, blotting some more on the left side. It's important when you use this blotting technique to avoid certain areas of the paper and miss sections so that you have some highlights and a beautiful transparency. You don't want to just cover the whole thing with gobs of paint. Make sure that you're missing sections to suggest light coming through the trees. I've darkened up the left side with a basic wash of indigo and burnt umber, and I'm painting more specific brush strokes suggesting that pathway, darkening up this bush on the right side. And in the right corner, there's going to be a much darker value too. So as I continue to build up my layers and add more blots of red, I want to be aware of where my darkest values are. So now I'm taking some more black and I'm painting in that right corner. We might have to do a couple layers here. The paper's still wet, so for now it's starting to spread out nicely. And then to make this whole painting come together, we need at least one little detail that's really realistic. So I'm painting this tree trunk with my black. You'll notice I've allowed some of that yellow to come in front of the tree trunk, so I've painted around that. And I'm adding some really specific little branches, kind of dangling down every which way. Try not to make these too perfect. Remember, in nature, you see a lot of asymmetry and imperfection when it comes to things like branches. So Mix it up a little bit, make sure your brush strokes aren't all going the same direction. And then the last thing is to just continue to add a few more layers of different colors. And again, remember to rinse in between so you have pure color. This is my permanent green number 1 again. And I'm just blotting that in where I want to add a little bit more green, adding a little bit more red here and there. And remember, it's important to skip certain little areas so that we have that translucent appearance of light shining through the trees. So just use a dabbing motion with your brush. Add as many layers as you want until you're satisfied with your overall composition. And I like to go really dark in my dark values, so I'm adding a couple more layers to those dark corners and creating a shadow shape under this bush just above the pathway, darkening up that right corner one more time. And then I'm adding some yellow ochre to the pathway so it looks a little bit more like the suggestion of dirt on the ground. A couple more washes of yellow to the trees as well. Make sure you don't paint over that area that's in the light because that's where our focal point is. Your eye is going to be drawn to that crisp tree with the light shining behind it. For painting number 2, I'm approaching this the same way as the first one by wetting the paper with clean water first. Make sure you have a nice glossy finish all over with no puddles or pools. The first color I'm using is Holbein Yellow Ochre. I've loaded it onto my brush and I'm going to paint an entire wash of yellow ochre all over the surface except for sort of a doorway. I'm leaving white, and that's where the sun is going to be shining through in this image. So you can paint right up to it, but make sure you're leaving a little bit of white showing through and allowing that paper, the white of the paper, to show through. Pull your yellow ochre all the way to the edge of the paper, and you can apply a little bit more pigment right under your doorway, suggesting the ground. That's going to be a bit darker in value. And you can add some vertical brush strokes through your white doorway to suggest fading trees in the sunlight. So once you've got a nice base layer of yellow ochre, work quickly. You'll want your paper to still be wet for this effect to look really soft. So now I'm grabbing indigo and I'm going to paint my darkest values on the outskirts of the painting. I'm using vertical up and down brush strokes and I'm painting the dark left and right sides of the image first. I'm grabbing some burnt umber now and painting more specific top to bottom brush strokes to indicate trees. You can see because our paper is still wet, the paint is blending out, almost suggesting cypress trees as the paint starts to fuzz a little bit. It almost looks like little branches coming out from those vertical trees. So the goal here is to have our darkest values on the edges of the painting and for the paint to get lighter as we come towards the light source, toward that beautiful glowing center of the painting. So I'm just adding some trees here very loosely for now. It doesn't look like much yet, but as we add more details, it will start to look like a forest. The next step is to add some orange. I'm using my Winsor & Newton transparent orange once again and just painting in between those brown trees and then adding this color to the foreground and creating a bush here on the side using that blotting motion with my brush that I used on the first painting. I've watered down my paint somewhat and I'm adding some yellow, and with this I'm softening those trees at the top so that they look less stark as they come up towards the ceiling. Continue to add vertical brush strokes. This is really the effect we're going for with this particular painting. Lots of up and down motions. The next step is to add more dark layers. We're going to add some more trees in the foreground, continuing to build up layer by layer with darker values. I'm using my indigo and burnt umber, which creates a nice rich black. Now to offset sort of all of these vertical brush strokes, the next thing we're going to do to make it even more realistic is add branches. So use some angled brush strokes and some more side-to-side brush strokes to create little suggestions of branches coming out of those large tree trunks, overlapping. Don't go too crazy with this or it'll look like thorns and thistles, but just a few here and there will really add some beauty to your overall composition. Now I'm just adding a few more trees in a slightly lighter value using a combination of my burnt umber and transparent orange. And this is helping it really look more detailed and more complex in the depths of those forests. In between the trees, I'm adding some layers of that, hence a yellow light, and a little bit more yellow ochre here and there, just continuing to build up those values. Towards the center, make sure that your values are lighter, creating that effect of this sunlight glowing through the trees. And If you want to, you can add one more layer of really dark trees on the outside of your painting. And as it begins to dry, these brush strokes will be more specific and will stay put. They won't soften quite as much. So this is your chance to add some really nice finishing details, wet on dry. And I'm just softening a little bit more here in the center of the painting. For the third and final painting, we're actually going to approach this one a little bit different. I have phthalo blue on my brush, and I'm using some blotting motions just to avoid little areas of the paper where we're going to be painting some orange trees in between the sky. But I'm using broader, more freer brush strokes towards the right side, suggesting a nice dark blue sky. And then to add some really interesting cloud effects, you can do some dark blue streaks, rinse your brush, and then apply some water right below those streaks so you end up with a lighter value underneath. Make sure to control the amount of water on your brush though by blotting it on a paper towel. You just need enough to get the paint flowing outward like this. And so I'm using that water in my brush to just pull the paint out and down, creating those beautiful streaky clouds. And you can see I'm also painting around this edge here in the center of the painting where the tree is going to be overlapping the sky. And then I'm filling in little areas of blue where we want the blue sky to be poking through those tree branches. So all of this, we're planning ahead for where the tree is going to go. The next step is to paint the bottom portion of the sky. I'm using permanent alizarin crimson by Holbein, quite watered down, and just adding a nice horizontal wash towards the bottom. And then we're going to paint the foreground. I'm using my Winsor & Newton transparent orange once again. You'll notice I'm missing little areas of the paper, and that's to suggest some highlights in the grass. Next, we're going to use that same orange color to paint in the tree. And just like we did with our first painting, I'm using a dabbing, blotting motion with the tip of my brush to paint a first layer using orange. And then I'm also introducing some burnt sienna and burnt umber for some of the darker values within the tree. You can also add some cadmium red or just use your richest orange that you have on your palette. The goal here is to create the effect of tree branches and foliage that's overlapping the sky. So where you painted some of your blue sky, try to mist that with your brush so that it's poking through the tree. And this first layer, you can also be a second layer as you come back to where you just painted. You can wash right over that with your brush. So we're going to continue to build up the values with more and more layers of brown, red, and orange. I've painted the tree trunk in brown, and then I'm adding in some more brown to the bottom of the tree, suggesting some shadows and some of the density in the foliage. Towards the center of the tree, of course, there's going to be more branches overlapping, so you want it to look thicker and darker. The next step is to paint your darkest values. So I've got some indigo and burnt umber on my brush, which when combined produces a nice rich black. I'm using that to paint the shadow underneath the tree trunk, and more dark values within the tree. And this is helping give it a nice 3D effect. It's helping it really pop and look lifelike and like it's standing out and strong up against that blue sky. Continue to use a dabbing motion. Don't have too much water in your brush or you may end up with some unwanted backwash. You can use your paper towel to control how much water is on there. But continue to build up those layers and values until you're really happy with your composition. I'm just adding a little wash of yellow into the sky, sort of connecting that pink to the blue. And then my last detail is to finish out the foreground with some more dark values, using some up and down poking motions with my brush to suggest grass coming up in front of the sky. And then there's one little bush off to the left that I want to add, so I'm painting that in with my burnt umber. Really light suggestions with the tip of my brush. And then if you want, you can go back in with some more yellow ochre and add some more leaves, some more foliage. If you're not happy with the shape of your tree, you can continue to extend it, make it rounder with some of your orange. And there is our finished study with our 3 fall landscape paintings. I hope you guys enjoyed this and were able to follow along. You can download my reference photos using the links below in the description. And of course, I include a list of all the supplies used in my video in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.